There are many different types of siege weapons in Age of Empires 2, from the bomber cannon and the trebuchet that allow you to take out units and buildings from long range, to the elephant rams and siege rams that allow you to break buildings from close range, as well as the scorpions and onagers that act as anti-unit siege weapons. There's really something for all situations. However, there's one situation that calls for a specific type of siege weapon that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the siege tower. The siege tower allows a player to bypass walls of all kinds, stone walls, palisade walls, you name it. And it doesn't do so by breaking the wall and allowing your units to funnel in. It actually does so by hopping over the walls using infantry or ranged units. Very effective in sneak attacks or to surprise your opponent who's only defending himself with one layer of wall. Now, the siege tower was first introduced to the African Kingdoms expansion. This is the expansion that featured the Malians, Berbers, Ethiopians, and the Portuguese. In fact, this expansion predates Definitive Edition, so we were first playing with the siege tower on the HD edition or on Vubli. And initially, this unit had the intended purpose, and that was it, which was to go over walls, and it really acted as a deterrent for people that were playing overly defensive. Back then, it was enough to just make a wall, and your opponent only had one option. He had to either be able to break the wall or he couldn't attack you. But with the introduction of the siege tower, you're actually able to hop over the wall without giving an alert to your opponent, acting as a very interesting aggressive option, and made the defender really have to think about what he was doing to defend himself. One layer of walls was clearly not enough, and so a lot of times you saw people going out of their way to maybe defend with a castle, or maybe just have something prepared in case their opponent did go for the siege tower option. Now, while it sounds really good to bypass your opponent's walls in a very sneaky manner, it only saw niche play, and in certain situations it was very good, but in most situations it really wasn't used. And a big part of that was actually the cost of the unit. You see, for the past 7 or 8 years since the siege tower was introduced, it costed 200 wood and 160 gold per unit. This is quite a hefty price, and just to put it in perspective, it's more expensive than a Mangano, more expensive than a Ram, and more expensive than 2 Scorpions, which was the other few units that you had available at the Siege Workshop. And so if you really didn't need the hopping over walls bonus, you never went for a siege tower. It was really expensive, and it didn't do a whole lot other than its intended purpose. However, now in a recent patch, it actually got a huge price decrease. It only cost 100 wood and 120 gold. So with a much more reasonable price, it kind of opened up to strategies involving the siege tower. The price is very reasonable for its intended purpose, and it definitely feels fair to pay 100 wood, 120 gold, and bypass the entirety of your opponent's walls. And let's be real, going over walls using archers and infantry is a pretty powerful tool, especially on maps like Arena, where all players start with a single layer of stone walls and are usually booming behind those walls. So if you're able to actually hop over with infantry and archers, you're able to take out a lot of villagers and basically deal game-ending damage to a player who's completely unsuspecting of such an attack. In fact, the most notorious strategy using the siege tower was the triple sling Goths Huskarl domination. That is still a very powerful strat to this day, but really took the ladder by storm 2 or 3 years ago. It basically involved triple slinging the Goths player in a 4v4, getting the Goths to Imperial Age before like minute 20, and just enabling the Goth player to spam elite Huskarls as fast as possible. And of course, this was done on maps like Arena, where the Huskarl player would just use siege towers to hit every single opponent player, not having to waste time on actually breaking down walls and, bringing some kind of heavy siege to take out gates and other defensive structures. You just bring the siege tower, hop over with elite Huskarls, and it would be a nightmare to defend for your opponents because they were just sitting there in Castle Age with very little going on for themselves due to the nature of the slinging Goth player being way ahead of the curve. In this situation, we can see the true power of the siege tower, allowing you to put heavy amounts of pressure in a quick and effective manner without having the downsides of waiting for siege to come in and take out the walls, which is a very slow alternative. All of this is making the siege tower sound incredibly strong and borderline overpowered if this is all there is to it. However, there are some downsides that are definitely worth considering, and the more the player base gains experience with this unit, the more people are aware of these obvious counters. Well, number one, the unit itself is pretty clunky, and so it takes a while to set up and bring it from one area of the map to the other, because you have to load it up, bring it over to the wall, and kind of set it up on the wall to allow units to jump in and out over the wall. It's a little bit clunky to get that to work, and so it's usually not as smooth and as effective as it sounds on paper to do it in practice. On top of that, it's actually quite easy to defend if you expect the strategy to come your way. All you have to do is build a second layer of walls so that enemy units cannot jump over. For example, even if you had a stone wall and then behind it just a piece of cheap palisade wall touching that stone wall all around the stone wall, that makes it so the siege tower can never actually bring units over the wall because it only bypasses one layer of wall and it can't bypass 2 layers of wall no matter how hard you try. Another thing the player using the siege tower has to worry about is that units that go over the wall can't go back the other way using the siege tower. So essentially, if you go over the wall with some units, those units are now trapped in the walls of your opponent. So if you're not dealing massive damage, or if the window of opportunity isn't great to have units on your opponent's side of the base, units, then you can run the risk of putting units into a trap. If your opponent is prepared and has a castle just out of sight, you can go in and get trapped, and it's just you in the castle and all units die. And so the more experience the player base gains with the siege tower, the more we're seeing these defenses come up and become popular, and so the attackers using the siege tower had less and less success as time went on. This led people to find other uses for it. Remember, it's still cheaper and pretty easy to spam, and so one can, let his mind wander a little bit and think of some other opportunities to use the siege tower, one that doesn't involve hopping over walls. This sounds crazy because the unit's entire original and intended purpose is just to hop over walls. In practice, this unit did nothing else, or so we thought. The player base has come up with such a creative use of the siege tower, and I call it the taxi strategy. I'm not sure if other people call it that, but the name had to come from somewhere. This is how the taxi strategy works. Players would put 10 units in their siege tower, and it's usually infantry units, but it can also be ranged infantry like Gebero or throwing axemen. They then run around the siege tower, eject the infantry to fight other units or to raid villagers, and then get back in the siege tower and continue running around again. This strategy is incredibly powerful, and it's hard to counterplay for a few reasons. So as gimmicky as it sounds, these 3 reasons make the strategy very legit and quite scary. Number 1, the tankiness of the siege tower. The siege tower has a ton of HP and pierce armor, much more than your average infantry, and so running in with infantry leaves you open to town center fire, castle fire, units like crossbows, cav archers, and all kinds of ranged threats. Putting them in a siege tower first lets you tank a lot of those arrows while you close the gap. The second reason is the fact that the siege tower moves faster when you put infantry in it, and it's not just a little bit faster like a ram, it moves significantly faster, to the point that with 10 infantry garrison in it, it moves as fast as a non-husbandry knight, which is pretty damn fast, especially for a siege weapon. And the third reason, and in my opinion the most important, is that monks cannot effectively convert a siege tower nor the units inside of it. And so generally speaking, if you charge into knights with infantry units, you're going to lose 3 or 4 of your units to conversions before you even close the gap and attack the monks. Using the siege tower, however, you can easily close the gap due to its speed and mobility, jump on top of the monks, and the opponent's monks cannot convert the siege tower without redemption. And even if you did get redemption, you can only convert the siege tower if you're right up next to it, like a ram or a trebuchet. However, in the cases of a ram and a trebuchet, those units have to be put in place to be effective. The siege tower can move, and the siege tower can move very quickly. And so the result is this: monks, even with redemption, cannot properly and effectively convert your siege tower. This makes the siege tower strategy insanely effective against monk defense, which is one of the more popular forms of defense, especially at the higher levels. And so nowadays, I would say that the #1 use of siege towers is the taxi strategy. I know it still works pretty well as a form of getting over a wall and putting pressure over your opponent like its intended purpose for all the reasons that I mentioned, but this taxi strategy is way better than any wall hopping could ever be. You see, wall hopping is situational. It doesn't help you every game, and it's not something that you do multiple times a game. It's one surprise strategy, and once your opponent is ready for it, it really just doesn't work. However, the taxi strategy works even if your opponent sees it coming a mile away. We don't really have an effective counter to a tanky siege weapon that's running around with infantry inside, especially with how quickly players are able to eject their units, have them fight a little bit, and then put them back in and continue running. It just means that the only way to actually beat this is to overpower it with so much army that the siege tower can never even run into your base. But this is a pretty unrealistic situation, and normally you're not going to have this much of an advantage in terms of military numbers compared to your opponent. And remember, the siege tower is not that big of an investment anymore, and so your opponent going for a siege tower instead of something else doesn't really set them behind much in terms of military. It only costs a couple hundred resources between wood and gold, and it's not this crazy investment that your opponent has to really commit to. He can just make one siege tower, throw it into his opponent's base, force all kinds of reactions, or else you lose a lot of your villagers, a lot of your potential momentum, and then you can just move on to other stuff while you're reacting to that kind of pressure. And to be honest with you, the main downside of the taxi strategy is just the clunkiness of the siege tower, which I mentioned earlier was one of its original downsides anyways. It's a little bit clunky to put units in and out of it. It performs in some weird ways, but honestly, the more you play with it, the more you feel like it's not that hard to control, and the fact that it moves so quickly when it has infantry in it kind of makes up for that clunkiness because you can avoid a lot of sticky situations. This new usage of the siege tower, in my opinion, shows just how creative the player base of Age of Empires 2 is, and it also highlights the challenges that the devs face when balancing AoE2. You see, the developers initially lowered the price of the siege tower because they wanted to see more siege tower strategies, more strategies that involved using the siege tower for its intended purpose, which is hopping over walls and surprising defensive opponents. But the devs certainly didn't expect players to use this cheaper siege tower as a taxi and a form of raiding your opponent without even caring if he was walled or not. So that's that's all I have for you guys today. This is the Siege Tower and its history in the metagame when it comes to Age of Empires 2. What do you think of the Siege Tower back then, and what do you think about it now? Do you like that it has multi-purposes, or do you prefer it to be just used as its original intended purpose, which is to hop over walls and nothing more? Do you guys like the taxi strategy, and is it fair use for a Siege Tower, or is it a little bit too much and not really part of what makes AoE2 AoE2? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Personally, I'm all over the place and my mind hasn't really made up itself regarding the Siege Tower, so I'm just presenting the information and letting you guys make your own opinion of it, and I'll be gladly reading the comments to figure out where my opinion stands based on the points made. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you guys want more content from me, check me out on Patreon for all the exclusive guides and content to get better at the game and to understand it in a deeper level, and also check me out on Twitch for my live streams. Links to both in the description below, and as always, have a great rest of your day and peace.